Little Johnny gets a brand new bike for Christmas, so he takes it out and he rides it around the block. Just as he's about to get back home, he pulls up next to this cop on a horse. The cop looks down at him. He says, "Oh, that's a nice bike, little buddy." He says, "Did you get that from Santa?" Little Johnny says, "Sure did." Well, then the cop writes him out a ticket, hands it down to him, and he says, "Next time tell Santa to put a tail light on that thing." Well, Johnny shakes his head and he takes the ticket and he says, "Hey, did you get that horse from Santa?" The cop smiles. He says, "Yeah, I did." He says, "Okay. Next time tell Santa that the dick on the horse belongs on the bottom and not on the top." Little Johnny has to walk to school, and every day he walks past this alley with these group of prostitutes. And every day that they see him, they go, "Hey, little boy." Well, Johnny doesn't think anything of it the first day, and he goes back and walks past the alley again the second day, and the girls go, "Hey, little boy." Oh, Johnny looks at him and goes, "Why do you do that to me every single time you see me?" And one of them says, "Well, because that's how big we think your penis is." Well, Johnny's all mad, and he goes off to school, and he thinks about it the next day, and he says, "Oh, I know what I'm going to do." And he walks past the alleys, and he looks at the ladies, and he goes, "Hey, ladies, how you doing?" There's this sex therapist that believes that people that have sex every day are the happiest. So he's at this conference, and he decides to test this theory, and he says, "Okay, I want everyone that has sex every day to raise their hand." And people raise their hand, and they're smiling, and they look all excited. He says, "Okay, I want people that have sex every week to raise their hand." So there's a little less people, but they raise their hand, and they're smiling, they're happy. He says, "Okay, now once a month." And about half the people in there, they raise their hand, and they're not as happy looking. And he figured, well, the people that have sex once a year are the most upset. So he says, "Okay, once a year." And there's one guy in the back of the room. It's little Johnny. He's smiling, and he's jumping up and down. And the therapist thought, well, wow, my idea must be wrong. And so he asked the guy, he says, "Okay, you said only once a year." He said, "Yes, only once a year." He says, "Well, why are you so happy?" And little Johnny says, "Because today's the day." Little Johnny and little Billy ended up going to court on a Friday afternoon for smoking dope. Judge says to them, "All right, guys, this is your first offense." He said, "If you can go over the weekend and persuade as many people as you can to quit smoking weed, I'll let you off all free charges." So they go and come back on Monday, and little Billy's up first, and judge says, "All right, how'd you do?" He says, "Well, I persuaded 17 people to quit smoking weed." He says, "How'd you do it?" He says, "Well, I drew 2 circles. I drew a big one and a smaller one. And I told them that the big one is your brain before drugs, and the small one is your brain after." So they all quit. He says, "Okay, great." He says, "All right, little Johnny, what did you do?" He says, "I drew a similar drawing." He says, "I drew a small one and I drew a big one. And I told everyone that this is your ass before prison and this is your ass after." 156 people quit. Who knew? Well, Johnny said to his mom one day, "I'd really like to have a pecan pie." She says, "Well, I don't have any pecans, so you'll have to go down to the store and get some." So Johnny walks on down and goes in the store, and he buys the pecans, and he steps out, and right across the street from him, there was this huge accident. A car and a truck hit head on, and the guy goes flying out. Little Johnny runs home as fast as he can. He says, Mama, there was an accident. A car, a truck, head on. The guy in the car, his arm went flying out this way, and his leg went flying out that way. And she's like, calm down, calm down. She goes, that's terrible. She goes, well, what happened to the nuts?" He goes, I don't know what happened to the nuts. My new friend Larry told me this joke, so I had to take it and turn it into a Little Johnny joke. Here it goes. Little Johnny's sitting there on the curb, and he's playing with a gallon of turpentine, shaking it up and down so he can see the bubbles. Meantime, a priest walks by and he says, what do you got there? He says, this here's turpentine. It's the most powerful liquid in the world. The priest says, no, that's where you're wrong. He says, the most powerful liquid in the world is holy water. If you take a little bit of holy water and you rub it on a pregnant woman's belly, she will pass a boy. Little Johnny smiles and looks up at him and he says, oh yeah? If you take just a little bit of this turpentine and rub it on my cat's ass, he'll pass a motorcycle. One day, little Johnny comes running downstairs. He says, Mom, I'll be back later. I'm going to go win us a turkey. She said, what do you mean you're going to win us a turkey? He says, yeah, there's a contest behind the old movie theater. The guy with the biggest pecker can bring home the turkey. She said, no, little Johnny, I don't want you going anywhere and pulling your pecker all out for the whole world to see. He said, Mom, I'm not going to pull it all the way out. Just enough so that I can win this turkey. I'll be back later. Little Johnny and little Susie went to Australia for their honeymoon. Well, on their first day there, they went swimming, and little Susie gets stung on the vajayjay by a jellyfish. Little Johnny's freaking out, and he calls up the Australian Coast Guard. He says, "G'day, mate." Little Johnny says, "Oh, I'm sorry to call, but my wife got stung by a jellyfish in her vagina, and she's all swollen up, and I don't know what to do, because you know what we like to do on our honeymoon, and can you please help?" And the guy on the phone says, "Bummer, mate." Little Johnny smiles. He says, "Oh, you're right, thanks." And he hangs up the phone. Little Johnny goes into a bar one night, and he's drinking, and finally he has to go to the bathroom. So he gets up and goes to the back, and about a minute later, he just hears, screaming so loud, and goes away. And about 45 seconds later, you hear, screaming again. Well, the bartender goes back there, and he knocks on the door. He goes, "Hey, knock that off. You're scaring my customers." Well, Johnny says, "You think I'm scaring your customers?" He goes, "Every time I go to flush the toilet, something jumps up and bites me in the balls." The guy opens up the door, looks down, and starts laughing. He goes, "Yeah, that's because you're sitting on the mop bucket." Little Johnny and little Susie had been married for about 15 years, and one day she stepped out of the shower, stands in front of the mirror, and she says, "Little Johnny, my breasts are too small." He says, "Well, if you want them to grow, you got to take some toilet paper and rub in between your breasts." So she grabs some toilet paper and she starts rubbing in between them. And she says, "Well, how long is this going to take?" He said, "Well, it'll happen gradually over the years. They'll definitely grow." And she stops and she says, "How do you know that my breasts are going to get larger by rubbing toilet paper over them gradually over the years?" He said, "Well, it worked for your butt, didn't it?" Teacher says, "All right, kids, turn in your homework." Little Johnny says, "Sorry, Teach. I don't have mine." She says, "Johnny, you had all weekend to do your homework. What happened?" He said, "My dog is in the hospital." She goes, "Oh my gosh, what happened?" He said, "Well, he ran out in the middle of the street. Car came up and hit him right in the ass." She says, "Little Johnny, you mean wrecked him?" He says, "No, Teach, not wrecked him. It damn near killed him." Little Johnny and little Susie had been married for about 15 years, and one day she stepped out of the shower, stands in front of the mirror, and she says, "Little Johnny, my breasts are too small." He says, "Well, if you want them to grow, you got to take some toilet paper and rub in between your breasts." So she grabs some toilet paper and she starts rubbing in between them. And she says, "Well, how long is this going to take?" He said, "Well, it'll happen gradually over the years. They'll definitely grow." And she stops and she says, "How do you know that my breasts are going to get larger by rubbing toilet paper over them gradually over the years?" He said, "Well, it worked for your butt, didn't it?" Hey, John, I ever tell you the story about when I lived with my abusive aunt and uncle?
Nope.
Well, we lived out on this farm with no animals. There's fields but no animals. And one day my uncle comes home with this filthy-ass horse. My aunt sees it and says, "Oh, it's so nice." And she wanted to name it Dirty. And they knew that I like to ride horses too. They said to me, "If we ever catch you riding that horse, we're going to beat your ass." And they do it because they've done it before. So one day I'm out in the field and playing with this tractor tire, and Dirty's next to me just eating grass and shit. And they kept looking outside, looking at me. And a couple minutes later, I decided to get in the tractor tire, and it just starts rolling down the hill. And my aunt and uncle, they come outside, and they see me rolling. They hating, patrolling, trying to catch me riding dirty. Little Johnny and his buddy Jimmy both work at the same factory, and they both ended up getting laid off. So they went down to the unemployment office and go on in, and the lady says to little Johnny, "Well, what is it that you do for a living?" He says, "I'm a panty stitcher." So she looks up panty stitcher, and it's unskilled labor. And she says, "I'm going to pay you $120 a week." And he says, "Okay," and he leaves, and Jimmy goes in. She says, "Well, what do you do for a living?" He says, "I'm a diesel fitter." She looks up diesel fitter, and diesel fitter is $200 a week. It's skilled labor. So Jimmy goes out and tells little Johnny, and little Johnny is livid. He goes on in, and he says, "Lady, why'd you pay me $120 and pay him $200? She says, "Well, because a panty stitcher is unskilled labor." He says, "What do you mean it's unskilled labor?" He says, "I sew all the elastic into the panties and thongs, and all he does is put them over his head and say, 'Diesel fitter.'" One day, little Johnny's playing with his toy cars on the living room floor. The pastor comes over and sits on the couch and is talking to little Johnny's dad. And little Johnny smashes one of his fingers with the car and says, "Oh, shit!" Well, Dad picks him up and brings him into his room and makes him sit in there for a half hour. Well, Johnny comes out and he sits on the couch next to the pastor, with his head down, and the pastor says, "You know, little Johnny, hearing those words come out of your mouth sent shivers up and down my spine." Well, Johnny looks up at him and smiles. He says, "Oh, yeah? Well, if you would have been here yesterday when my dad hit his finger with the hammer, you'd have froze to death."